People no longer bound by their non-disclosure agreements. What can you now disclose? Story 1. My cousin started his first job at one of the top marketing firms in the country. Now this guy is ridiculously good looking. I mean, he used to be a national model for Abercrombie & Fitch, not just some local store model. He always dressed sharp and carried himself with confidence. So naturally, people noticed him right away. But what happened next wasn't exactly what he expected. His boss's boss, a high-up male executive, started hitting on him aggressively. It wasn't subtle. There were constant invitations to lunch, then dinner, and eventually offers to spend weekends at the boss's house. Every time, my cousin said no, politely but firmly. He wasn't interested and made that clear. But the boss just kept pushing. One day, while riding in the boss's car, the guy didn't even try to hide it anymore. He bluntly told my cousin that if he just spent the weekend with him, his career would skyrocket, fast promotions and opportunities. My cousin felt a sick pit in his stomach, but kept his cool. Secretly, he hit the record button on his phone and captured the entire conversation. He knew he needed proof. After that, my cousin ghosted the boss's invitations for weeks, not answering calls or emails. Eventually, the boss stopped asking, probably realizing my cousin wasn't going to give in. Then came the real shock. 3 months into the job, during his performance review, HR and his direct supervisor called him in for a meeting. They began rattling off a series of vague complaints. Not a good fit, doesn't work well with the team, and similar remarks. Then came the blow. They were letting him go. In that moment, my cousin felt a surge of emotion, anger, frustration, disbelief, all tightening inside him. But he didn't panic or lash out. Instead, he stayed composed, calmly took out his phone, and played the recording of his boss's inappropriate proposition right there in the conference room. The silence was deafening. He looked directly at the HR manager and asked, "Anything to say now?" Both the HR manager and his immediate supervisor left the room, clearly rattled. After about an hour, the HR manager returned, this time with the harassing boss on a conference call. Their tone had shifted. They began throwing around threats of legal action. Recording private conversations is illegal. We'll press charges, and similar warnings. My cousin just laughed. He told them he was more than ready to take it public, and that the company would love the media attention such a scandal would bring. Within 3 days, my cousin was signing a non-disclosure agreement and cashing a settlement check enough to cover almost all of his law school tuition. But here's the part that still makes me angry. The guy who essayed him? He wasn't fired. Not only that, but he's still working at the company and has even been promoted since. My cousin's experience showed me how brave he was to stand up to such power and harassment. It wasn't easy, but he fought back, kept his dignity, and won. Still, the system let him down in the end, and that's the bitter truth. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. So, I used to work for this company that tracked how much money movies made at the box office. We had tons of data, like more than most people realized. The movie studios started freaking out because they didn't want anyone leaking info. So, they made everyone on every team sign NDAs. Here's the funny part. The NDAs went out the exact day I was moving from one team to another. Somehow, I was the only person who didn't have to sign one. I still don't know why. Maybe it was luck or just a mix-up, but it felt pretty special at the time. Now for the crazy story. There was this weekend when 2 big movies opened: Lilo and Stitch, the cartoon, and Minority Report with Tom Cruise. The official numbers said Minority Report made the most money that weekend. But here's the secret no one talked about. That wasn't true. Lilo and Stitch actually made a little more cash, but the studios made a deal behind the scenes so Minority Report would be reported as number 1. Why? Because 20th Century Fox couldn't handle the idea of a big Tom Cruise movie getting beaten by a cartoon. So, they worked something out with Disney, who made Lilo and Stitch. Nobody ever found out what Disney got in return, but that's just how Hollywood works. Sometimes it's not all honest numbers. And just to add some drama, Minority Report was directed by Steven Spielberg. He just had a flop with his last movie AI, so if Minority Report didn't come in first, it could have hurt his career a lot. So that deal probably saved his reputation too. Looking back, it's wild to realize how much stuff happens behind the scenes that we never hear about. The numbers we see? Sometimes they're just stories. Story 3. I'm a software engineer and worked for a startup who wanted to be the next commission junction. The company was located in LA, though I was not. Every executive that worked for the company was really shady. Also, just about everyone was an executive with the exception of me and 3 to 5 other employees. As soon as the CEO invested, he took over and made it clear that anyone who said anything to anyone outside of the company, he would sue relentlessly. Our cast of characters, the COO, who ultimately landed in federal prison for drug-related issues. The CEO, a bored millionaire who sold his brick-and-mortar empire for around $500 million, then got talked into funding the COO's internet startup. The CIO collected a full salary and stock options, all while secretly owning an offshore code farm in India through a silent partnership. He funneled 70% of the engineering budget into his own pocket. And the CTO, formerly in business with the COO, narrowly avoided prison by escaping to Cyprus. Here are some of the crazy times we had together. I'm at my desk, deep in code, when the CEO pops his head in and says, "Hey, with Act 101, I'm swamped. Need you to go pick up my wife." Without waiting for a response, he tosses the keys to his Bentley onto my desk. Now, as tempting as it might be to take a Bentley for a spin, I was in the middle of resolving a critical issue. One he himself had labeled my top priority with an end-of-day deadline. I pushed back, pointing out that chauffeuring his wife wasn't exactly in my job description. He shrugged and said, "Whatever I ask you to do is in your job description. More on that later." So I drove to pick up his wife, 25 years younger than him, former hostess at one of his restaurants, and very much the textbook definition of a trophy wife. I'm in my hotel room working and drinking, at about 11:30 at night. COO calls. "With Act 101, CEO and I are at his restaurant, and it's dead here. Get on Craigslist and find some girls to meet us here. Search for independent and white, then look for a blonde, a brunette, and a redhead." A couple of weeks later, it's the weekend, still working, still late at night. The COO starts calling me. I ignored the first call. Then the second. Finally, he texts, "Site is down, please call me." I was worried it was serious, so I called him back immediately. He answers, clearly drunk. "Haha, with Act 101, I knew you'd call if I said that. CEO, CTO, CIO, and I are in Vegas having a high-stakes poker game in our hotel room. Get on Craigslist and send some girls over." Fed up with this nonsense, I fired up my soft phone, spoofed his number, and called Korn Model S Worker Service in Vegas. I order 4 models on the company card, $3,000 each, $12,000 total. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It's the COO, furious. "What the hell do you think you're doing? My bank just flagged a charge to Korn Model S Worker Service." He then never asked me to find girls for him again. The company's burning through cash at an alarming rate, and the CEO has been yelling at the execs all day. After work, a few of us head down to one of the CEO's restaurants for drinks. Thanks to our carte blanche, we could order whatever we wanted. The CTO shows up and starts drinking heavily. Since I was sober, he asked if I could drive him home. I agree. On the drive, he suddenly started sobbing. I assume it's because he recently found out he might be facing prison time. But no, he's in tears because his Range Rover is 5 years old, and with how things are going at the company, he's convinced he'll never be able to afford a new one again. Story 4. I signed an NDA after negotiating a 6-figure settlement with my mortgage lender. Back in 2013, the bank illegally sold my home while I was living there and making monthly payments. I discovered this when new owners evicted me and my 3 kids. At the time, I thought someone was trying to steal my identity, etc. I spent the next 2 years writing legal documents and had to represent myself in court. The bank owned every legitimate legal firm I contacted. Also, the first lawyer I hired took my last $7,000 and was promptly disbarred for misconduct with previous cases. I had no money and no home, but I had a laptop, a printer, and access to the county court law library. We were about a week away from selecting a jury when we came to a settlement agreement. In the end, each of my kids, now in their 20s, got an inexpensive new car, and I live at the beach. Which bank, you ask? I can't tell you the name, but might I suggest that it rhymes with case? They settled because they were worried that if the case went to trial, it would become public. Then everyone would know for certain that they had lied, cheated, and swindled to steal homes from hardworking people. The bank would lose when no one took out new loans with them. I received a posting on my front door. I went to the eviction court and lost because, technically, the new owners paid for my house. I was given 7 days to move all my stuff. I had lived there 13 years, or face the sheriff. I had 3 kids. I didn't want the drama of handcuffs. So we packed and moved, then sought relief through the court system. Story 5. McDonald's made me sign an NDA regarding a robbery that took place during a graveyard shift. They made me take a freaking polygraph test because they thought my ex and I were involved due to the simple fact that I had stopped by that day to pick up some documents. I was a manager. I had business to do. F.U. McMurda. I was around 19 to 20 years old. This was almost a decade ago. I was pretty naive then. By the time I realized this might have been illegal, I mentioned it to a co-manager, and she advised me to not bring it up again, as to not involve myself in trouble or damage my future job prospects. I worked at a franchise located in a rural area with an almost entirely Latino population, where everyone knows each other. I took home some of the weekly schedules and production projections for highlighting. They would make me do this highlighting crap weekly. The store manager in charge would allow me to do this on a weekly basis. The area supervisor called to tell me I'd have to take a polygraph test. He mentioned that I could decline taking the polygraph test, but I'd be taken off the schedule, and I wouldn't be trusted again. The police showed up to the restaurant, picked me up, held me at the investigation building for around 8 hours, and then they sent me home. When I passed the polygraph test, the area supervisor called again to mention that he appreciated that I took the polygraph, was glad to hear I passed, and that he would always have my back. I rolled so hard, I could see the front of my brain. I left the job at McDonald's in 2014. Story 6. The club was run by the most pretentious and racist jerk of a man. Seriously, he allowed racial slurs to be used by patrons. I'm half Asian and heard chink being used. I was asked where my homeland was, and my Latina coworker was asked if we served chimichangas. Our kitchen only served overpriced, fine dining Mediterranean food. The owner ever so subtly fired a good bunch of our non-white staff, while promoting the incompetent white male ones. The chef stated that he would never allow staff to eat the food he made, even excess food at the end of the day that would have gone in the trash. We were throwing out a $2,000 lunch buffet every day. The place was only a few months old and had the highest turnover rate of staff that I've ever experienced. 7 out of 20 or so staff members quit in 1 week. I was literally going to HR on a weekly basis. One time I went after a manager who assumed a guest was from the Middle East because he looked disheveled and had a long beard. They also were notorious for firing staff for completely made-up reasons, as in they once told one of the best members on staff that she was fired due to 1 or 2 late clock-ins. In reality, it was because of an interaction between her and a coked-up member who lied in a letter to the owner, even though I looked over security footage and saw that nothing he had stated was true. Oh, and they made all the female staff wear these matronly made uniforms while the male staff wore suits for the exact same position. And none of the managers ever took fault or assumed responsibility for anything that went wrong. Anyways, I got out of that toxic work environment. I was witnessing too many breakdowns on a weekly basis, and the owner made it very clear that being white and rich or famous were the most important things. One of the managers was from one of the richest families in the U.S. Screw treating people like humans, screw caring about your own staff. Luckily, HR wound up helping me land a job that paid 3 times as much as I was earning because they knew my complaints were valid. And I'm currently working at the best, most supportive place I could have imagined, especially in times like these. Seriously, my current boss's emails make me shed tears because of how much he genuinely cares about everyone. That's why there are never any new job openings, because no one ever leaves. Complete night and day difference. Story 7. Here in Canada, the YV University pays recruiters commissions based on how many students they can enroll in their MACP, Med, business programs, and T-Film school courses. Because of this, recruiters often lie or use high-pressure tactics just to get you to pay the application fee. Their main goal is the fee, not your education. This pressure to apply is intense. The bigger problem is worse in the US, where student loans fuel the system, but Canadian institutions like YV are trying to reach that same model, charging outrageous tuition fees while delivering a subpar product. Students are forced to take out massive loans just to cover the costs. YV and T-Film School are essentially part of the same for-profit company, run by people connected to disreputable chains like DeVry, the now-defunct Education Management Corporation, and Art Institute, all of which have faced lawsuits and shutdowns. They've been known to cancel programs midway, leaving students with little recourse, especially at T-Film School. Many of their online programs lack proper accreditation or external evaluation. In just 8 months, I witnessed them shut down 3 different programs abruptly. Plus, if enrollment in a required course is too low, they simply won't run it, delaying graduation indefinitely. And the fees? Exorbitant. The online art programs were launched under shaky regulatory approval. Because YV has degree-granting status for some master's programs, they spun off T-Film School online diplomas as associate. Diploma's a certification that isn't officially recognized in Canada. Their argument is that skills and portfolios matter more than the actual diploma's legitimacy, but this is misleading. They are very slippery about who actually teaches or develops courses, often name-dropping big names or productions that have little or no real connection. They specifically target people who don't fully understand what they're signing up for. They use emotional manipulation during interviews to find your pain points and push you into enrolling. If they make it sound exclusive, it's not. If you have a credit card and meet the bare minimum requirements, you'll be accepted. There have also been widespread issues with plagiarism and academic dishonesty. Of course, there are some great students and instructors there, but you'll find that anywhere. If you're considering applying, I strongly urge you to look at more reputable, honest institutions instead. Story 8. My best friend worked at a roadside attraction near Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's supposedly a waterfall inside a cave. Of course, the trail to the cave is redone with all sorts of rock brought in from around the world. I think they've owned up to that part now. But the waterfall itself is barely a trickle naturally, and then only in the wetter season. They've run a pipe up there to supplement the falls, hidden by cracks and crevices and cemented over, and powered by a pump off to the side, which you can't hear when the water is splashing down from 100 feet overhead. It's 99% from the city of Chattanooga, or maybe Lookout Mountain, municipal water supply. Of course, with such a wet area, old electrical wires going back to the Great Depression, and 300 feet underground, it sputters or shorts out and stops every now and then. The first rule in the falls room is make everybody leave immediately if the power goes out. Not for safety, but because the fable agreed upon will be shown as fake. Story 9. I worked at a very beat-up zoo/amusement park. I ran the roller coaster. We weren't fancy enough to actually have a real roller coaster with one stop button and one go button. Instead, it was a crappy 2-story kid coaster, and the brakes were manual. I was one of the 2 supervisors/trainers for this ride because it was very difficult to learn, and you could hurt someone if you weren't careful. There were people who could run the ride, but only 2 people who could actually certify and train others to run it. So, we have this hotshot who has been working there for 3 months. He tells our boss that he should be a trainer. He knows how all the rides work, yada, and our idiot boss give him the go-ahead. So, hotshot puts this girl, we'll call her Courtney, on the roller coaster and trains her. It takes a good week to learn the controls, and probably another few days to get comfortable enough to do it by yourself. So, I come in for my shift, and hotshot waltzes up to me with a grin. Guess who trained Courtney on the kiddie coaster? I couldn't have run faster. By the time I had gotten to the ride, the poor girl was losing her mind. Hotshot loaded up the carts full of people, and just left her after a couple of hours of training. Courtney has been trained just enough to keep the coaster going slow enough it wouldn't fly off the tracks, but she couldn't stop the coaster itself. Those people were stuck on that coaster for probably 20 to 30 laps, when we usually just do 2. I had to sign an NDA after a whole bunch of customers threatened to sue the park. Ending of the story for those concerned. I jumped the tracks, Spider Monkey climbed into the control box and stopped the ride for Courtney, and let her take the day for herself. So traumatizing to be poorly trained and risk severely injuring people because some a-hole took acid the night before work and asked for a promotion to be a trainer. And my boss let him. Story 10. The popular dog kennel I worked for would have people leave their dogs for long periods of time. Dogs would stop eating. They wouldn't tell the owners this. People would leave beds and special toys and treats for their pet, thinking they'd get these items, a little slice of home. These items would go in a trash bag, and it would be set aside. Treats would be thrown out. They used the excuse that it created too much laundry, and that having personal items in a dog's kennel made them aggressive and protective over their stuff towards both humans and other dogs. Okay, but no, these are people's pets. They're not frigging wolves. Short of making a Facebook post that no one would see, I had no real way of telling the public and risking some BS lawsuit because I signed an NDA like a dummy, but I told everyone I knew with a dog to tell other dog owners not to send their dog there. Your dog can't tell you what happens when you're not around. Dogs would run into us with their tails wagging because they liked the yard workers, but the conditions overall weren't great. Dogs are so good and loyal. Small spaces and loose regulations on how many dogs you can have at once. It still boils my blood when I drive by. Hopefully things there are better now. Story 11. Approximately 80% of everything I did working in healthcare analytics was later explicitly made illegal by the Affordable Care Act. U.S. health insurance companies were up to some absolutely horrific things before that law passed, to the point where I gave statements to staff members at both of my senators' offices when they were in hearings about it. Both were Republican and opposed it in the end anyway. The data they can now easily access, your entire Twitter and Facebook history, your social circles, your location patterns, is staggering. I live with a constant low-level anxiety that the ACA might get overturned. If that happens, I fully expect insurance companies to unveil shiny new programs designed to help underserved communities. And if you remember the subprime lending crisis, you'll know exactly what that means. Finding new ways to exploit vulnerable, uninformed people at every turn. One of the middle-of-the-pack examples. Some conditions, like diabetes that turns into end-stage renal failure, get horrifically expensive. So, we would determine who was likely to progress to that point based on all the data we had, and someone would pull their files and look for the wrong color ink or a single missed checkbox. And they would retroactively deny all of the coverage and send them a bill for the total amount. For people who were about to be diagnosed with a fatal condition, and we knew it but didn't tell them. We did far worse than that, too. Story 12. I served in the military from 2007 to 2009. The unit I was assigned to had the second highest self-offing rate and the lowest re-enlistment rate in the entire military. 3 people jumped from the 3rd deck of the barracks, and I had a table thrown at me on my first day in the unit. During a training exercise, I was kept awake by a rotating shift of people for 5 days straight. Our NCOs poured salt water down the barrels of our cannons just to keep us busy. I had to walk around a convoy of vehicles for 4 hours while everyone else got to sleep because I missed a platoon meeting that I didn't even know existed. I had been pulled off a firing range and missed the briefing. I stood 2 separate fire watch shifts in one night because I didn't have my gear 15 minutes before a platoon formation. I was in the back of my Humvee, which admin took to get us chow. I wasn't present when they told everyone to get their gear ready. The corporal basically threw me under the bus. The frustrating part is that if I had kept quiet and not raised the issue, I would have been fine because the Humvee with my gear got back in time. 3 NCOs came into my room to confront me about some discoloration on my uniform, and it almost turned violent, especially when I told them I couldn't afford to replace it. I ended up punching an oak bookshelf and broke my pinky finger. A corporal told a private first class to get MRE heaters out of a trash bag. The PFC basically said, "No thanks, I'm eating," and didn't do it. The corporal then told me to do it while I had a spoonful of food in my mouth. I paused, looked at him, and then he tackled me to the ground and grabbed me by the neck. At that moment, I pulled out my knife, ready to defend myself. Our gunnery sergeant pulled the corporal off me just in time. Eventually, I didn't trust anyone in my unit, and they had to separate me. They gave me an honorable discharge in exchange for keeping quiet for 10 years about everything that went on. I also want to mention the time when we had to fill out pre-deployment screening forms. About 70% of the unit indicated thoughts of self-harm, or that they wouldn't intervene if a platoon mate was in danger. Our staff NCOs were told to discard those forms and stood over us while we filled out new ones to make sure we didn't tell the truth. This was to keep the unit deployable and preserve its funding. Later, it was pointed out to me that the NDA I signed wasn't a real one, just another mind game played on me as a naive 19-year-old. But at the time, I thought I had no choice but to agree. Story 13. Many years ago, some major phone carriers from the UK, Spain, and the US were offering a revolutionary service, voicemail to text. The pitch was simple: your voicemails would be automatically converted into text messages and sent straight to your phone. The catch: there was nothing automatic about it. Behind the curtain, all those private messages were being beamed to call centers in third world countries like mine in the Dominican Republic, I later learned another in India was doing the same thing. There, we sat in cubicles, headsets on, listening to your most intimate, private moments, and manually typing out everything we heard. We were sworn to secrecy. Everything was under NDA, and no cell phones were allowed inside the building. They never explicitly told us we were working for those big-name carriers. Instead, they came up with a fake company name to make it sound like it was some obscure transcription service. But it didn't take much to connect the dots. People left carrier names in their voicemail greetings and messages all the time. The most unsettling part? There was a list of forbidden topics we were absolutely not allowed to talk about, and right at the top was the company itself and the carriers. It was a tightly controlled operation, as if they knew they were skating on thin ice. Curiosity got the better of me, so I started digging around. Buried in the terms and conditions of some of these carriers was a vague clause. Some messages may be used to train our software. But in reality, that clause was twisted into an excuse to offload every single message offshore. My call center alone had about 300 people, working across 3 shifts to maintain 24/7 coverage. I'll never forget listening to a voicemail that included a husband's secret confession to his lover, another that was a terrified caller reporting a domestic incident, and yet another where an elderly man was pouring his heart out, thinking no one else would hear. But we heard it, and we typed it, word for word. Story 14. That married grocery store manager in his late 40s was, indeed, banging that 18-year-old courtesy clerk in the compressor room. This was 15-plus years ago when I was a person in charge, and not yet a full assistant store manager. Our store in the back room had a couple of rooms upstairs, a large room that housed all of our electrical breakers and backup generators, and a room that housed all of our compressors that kept our freezers and coolers running. Both were locked at all times for security reasons. They were accessible only through the back room. The 18-year-old courtesy clerk, Bagger, had worked there for a while. She was not the best worker. She had a habit of disappearing for a half hour or hour at a time. I and the other PICs complained and tried discipline, but the store manager blocked it. So we just dealt with it. Yes, she was an attractive blonde. I was in charge one night, and we got an alarm that one of the compressors was low. It was my job to check the level, record the compressor number, and turn it in. When I went up to the room, the door was propped open with a bucket. I assumed whoever worked in the room last left it open. If you have never been in a compressor room before, I have to tell you that it is loud. Our store had several diesel engines that powered the compressors. I proceed into the back of the room, come around a corner to see the girl, not quite bare but not fully clothed, being serviced by our store manager, who had left for the day hours ago. Neither saw me, and I hightailed it out of there. I wrestled with what to do. I was worried about my career at the time, so I called the security hotline and made an anonymous call and told them in vague terms what happened and that they should contact me about details. I'm 100% certain that they knew it was me that called. A couple of days later, the store manager is suspended, and I'm interviewed, the assistant store manager is interviewed, and the PICs. They tell us not to discuss it, so of course we did. I was a little late to the party. Almost everyone knew. The store manager would use his store keys to come into the back room, meet the courtesy clerk, and then would hook up in the compressor room. She was not the first girl he had done this with at this store and others. They fire the store manager, and like an idiot, he sues. Dozens of people are deposed. NDAs are drawn up and signed. He thinks better of it, drops the suit, and that's the last I ever heard of him. The girl quit right after the store manager was suspended. Story 15. I was a contractor for NASA. I still fully support the agency, but I was extremely bugged when I learned that each separate NASA center, e.g. JPL, Kennedy, Ames, Goddard, hides many of its inventions and breakthroughs from the other centers, so that when HQ is ready to assign a big mission and a lot of dollars to one center, they have a better chance to compete over the others. Look what we invented. Ames can't do this over there. Give us the next moon orbiter. The downside is that there is a ton of reinvention and duplicated efforts going on. Sometimes years of work go down the drain when another center does the same thing faster. My perspective was you all work for NASA. Share knowledge, collaborate. I was frequently ordered to tone down anything revealing when speaking to other centers. Story 16. I used to do data analysis of revenue management for some big companies. Many companies have no clue about their data or their revenue streams. I'm talking about several $1 million of revenue disappearing in the pipeline and no one knowing what happened with it, or even caring really. There were multiple times I had to inform clients that we had huge gaps in their costs, and we needed to find the missing numbers somewhere in order to make our final reports correct, and was met with the paraphrased reply, "Just sprinkle the missing costs over the existing ones. We just want the final total to be correct." All the companies cared about if the amount of money they have at the end of the year is higher than at the beginning, and anything that happens in between is inconsequential. I objected at first to my bosses, saying that what we were doing was incorrect, but they said to just do as the client said. In the end, I got disillusioned, and whenever our clients came with requests that made no mathematical or logical sense, I'd just execute as requested and let their analysts figure out later that the analysis they paid 6 figures for was basically nonsense. I didn't care because I had documentation of all their requests and my objections, which were thoroughly ignored. I had a few cases where clients came back disgruntled several months down the line after some in-house analyst had done a deep dive of their data and came up with objections that I had pointed out months before. I'd usually dig up the relevant emails and clear my name. My choice of action was to tell them to pound sand, but my bosses always bent over backwards for clients, so we'd have to do the cleanup I anticipated. In the end, I learned most of our economy is held together by duct tape and wishful thinking. At most, 10% of people working at big companies are competent and carry the bulk of the work, and rarely are the competent ones the ones in charge. Story 17. I used to work for a construction company in rural Texas, and man, we did so much shady stuff. Honestly, my boss was like the Joe Exotic of construction, always calling us horrible names, yelling at us, and threatening to fight us. None of our haul trucks could pass a state inspection because he was too cheap to fix them up. He never paid his taxes on any of the track. Anytime the tax man would show up, we would have to drive all the equipment deep into the woods to hide it. He always paid off the OSHA inspector because he knew our shops couldn't pass inspection. We had mountains of scrap metal in the woods. Mountains of old oil buckets stacked in the woods. We had an old rail car in the back that was full of oil/hydraulic/transmission fluid. The cap was off, so when it rained, it overflowed and would just drain into the earth. I can't count how many times we would get some equipment in, and he would tell us to dump the fluid into one of the ponds. We always had guys up there trying to sell drugs and things. Telling you, my 3 years there were wild. Story 18. This will get buried, but here is a dirty little secret. Stores like Ross, TJ Maxx, Marshalls, etc. don't actually sell overstock and canceled orders. Most of the merchandise is private label with a made-up MSRP. The name brand stuff you do find is typically made exclusively for them, and it's lower quality. Those Michael Kors handbags are lower-end materials and do not carry a warranty like ones bought in full-line stores. Those stores focus on the hunt with made-up MSRPs to trick the customer. Now they do buy canceled orders still, but those represent a small fraction. Think about how many thousands of off-price retail stores exist. There are not that many overstocks and canceled orders. Supply chain-wise, this method would fail. Source off-price operations manager for 5 years. Story 19. We reused buffet-style food served in a cafeteria that we're supposed to compost and record as waste. The health inspector says anything that's left open buffet-style and self-serve can't be taken back and repurposed because it's not monitored and could be cross-contaminated or many other things. Nobody should ever eat buffet-style if avoidable, FYI. But the Fortune 500 company I worked for was unhappy about the money they were losing by composting the food. So they made us keep it and reserve it later or repurpose it into soup or casserole or something. Personally, I never did this and just waited for my boss to leave and compost the food, but others I worked with were too worried about losing their jobs to go against orders. I didn't want to be fired but felt morally obligated to not feed people food that was meant to be garbage, so I just sneakily tossed it out when nobody was looking because I got paid really well there. We all had to sign NDAs, saying we wouldn't tell the media or non-employees about recipes and procedures that covered leftover food and food waste. Eventually my boss discovered what I was doing, and I stood up to him about not being willing to reuse garbage as food, so we agreed that I'd just quit because while they could force me not to talk about it, they couldn't actually force me to do something illegal for my job, and I was clearly refusing to do it. Story 20. I worked as a research intern at an NYC department, and strangely enough, I wasn't made to sign any NDA until I officially got the research position. During my internship, I had access to a huge number of residents' mental health data GAD-7 and PHQ-9 scores, along with names, addresses, phone numbers all on spreadsheets. Honestly, that felt like a massive privacy risk. Luckily, I respect mental health confidentiality deeply and would never dream of exploiting that info. But still, what a massive oversight on their part to leave that kind of sensitive data so accessible. And speaking of oversight, the medication doses some of the elderly here are prescribed? Man, some doctors should seriously be investigated. There was this one old lady taking 10 milligrams of Xanax every single day. 10 mg. That's way beyond normal. It blew my mind. You wonder how that even gets approved. Someone should be held accountable. Story 21. When I was in my first grad program in New York, I got really excited about a certain line of research because of a class I took there. The professor was enthusiastic, and I liked him. I wanted to join his lab, but there was some burning tension between us, so we both knew it was a bad idea. When I say burning tension, I mean e.g. we met a few times a week to discuss research, and he would tell me he thought I was attractive, which at the time, when I was 21, felt really good for me to hear from this intelligent, successful, and equally attractive person. Still, I needed him to help me find a lab to join or stick up for me with the department to help me get into another lab. My advisor was possessive and didn't want to let me switch labs. He didn't want to help me because he didn't want to have to deal with my PI's resentment in the department. One night, I went to a bar near campus for a drink with a friend. I noticed that professor sitting nearby me at the bar, but we both pretended not to see each other. The next day, he filed a Title IX complaint stating that he felt I was obsessed with him and told the administration that he thought I had stalked him at a bar. My PI had asked him for help filing a complaint about me to push me out of the program. My PI reported that I showed signs of mania or mental illness, citing that I'd hired 20 TS for an experiment that only required 3. When in reality, that had been a simple misunderstanding. Her postdoc and I were running an experiment, and I was told to hire as many TS as we can get, so I hired 20. Apparently, the PI only wanted 5 or so. My PI, the postdoc, and I had all met to fix the problem, and it wasn't a big issue. I wasn't allowed to talk about any of this at the time, and I ultimately ended up mastering out of that PhD program because of all of it. Story 22. I worked as an accountant. There were basically 4 of us handling over 100 clients. I don't know how it is in other countries, but here, companies have to pay certain taxes for things like health insurance, pension funds, and other contributions. The tax is a set percentage, so the higher the pay, the higher the taxes. Most people here earn minimum wage, and the median wage is only a bit higher. Keep in mind your pension depends on these taxes, not only whether you get it, but also how much you receive. While processing wages for these companies, we were ordered to use a certain loophole in the law to lower those taxes. The employee would still receive their normal pay, usually minimum wage, but the taxes on that pay would be much lower. So, if the minimum wage was $300, the pension calculated would be about $200. With this method, the pension was only $120. Because of how complicated taxes are, most people wouldn't even realize this was happening until they saw a smaller pension check later on. On top of that, we had to adjust the numbers for profit and revenue to reduce other taxes. We were also forced to give legal advice based on very limited knowledge of the laws. I had taken one law class in management, so I was the best qualified, but honestly knew very little. And to top it all off, there was even selling of client data to rival companies if the price was right. Eventually, I left after a few months. My 3 coworkers followed about a month later because there was no way I wanted to risk serious trouble over people's greed, trying to avoid paying the minimum while living luxuriously as business owners. Story 23. It's not an NDA. It's a secrecy agreement with DoD that elapsed after 25 years. I worked as a programmer for the U.S. Air Force on the global USAF budget from 1979 through early 1981. There was a period of time after Reagan became a leading candidate, but before he won the election or took office. Jimmy Carter was a lame duck president, and many senior officers really hated him. During this time, the USAF had flown the B-1. Not the B-1A, not the B-1B. This was when it was just the B-1. People had spent a significant portion of their careers working on delivering the B-1 program. They really believed in the B-1 as a strategic long-range supersonic bomber. Jimmy Carter hated the B-1. He viewed it as a wasteful, unnecessary, bloated program designed to keep the builders afloat at the expense of the taxpayer. He had canceled the project in something like 77. But a couple of flying examples were available but never saw service. Reagan loved the B-1. It was everything he loved about our military programs. Fast, sexy, high-tech, and better than anything the Soviets had. All of that being said, here's what happened. Jimmy Carter gave explicit orders that the only two B-1s currently flying be broken up into parts, the program be completely canceled, the engineering materials be archived at the Pentagon, and all funding be ended. He wanted direct evidence sent to him that this had happened, in the form of pictures of the broken-up aircraft. Ronald Reagan was informed of this order by sources in our organization. Reagan let it be known that Carter's order was absolutely not to be followed under any circumstances. Now, where do I come in? I was just this guy working on the AF budget. It was a top-secret clearance, mainly because any analyst could correlate money to named projects, both globally and on bases. So one day I am going over daily reports, and I see this massive new expenditure for, I think. Right, Patterson? It's not in the approved project list. It's not in the unapproved project list. So clearly, it has not gone up to Congress. Yet, the money is actually in the dispersal. So I go to my boss and I point it out. It doesn't belong there, so obviously it's a mistake. He agrees and we reverse it. A couple of days later, all hell breaks loose when a general officer I had never seen before comes rampaging through the office demanding to know who shorted his funding. Now, at this point we get hauled into a room, sworn to secrecy, and told to fund this maintenance project. What was the project? Pay a huge team of contractors to very carefully disassemble one of the B-1s, drag in parts from other aircraft, show it being crushed, and send pics to Carter. Meanwhile, reassemble the plane and hide both of them inside black hangars. And that was why Reagan was able to have the program restarted literally within days of taking office. The program was fully back online in 1981. Story 24. I worked in the QA department at THQ for about 3 to 5 years before the company collapsed. The job was so soul-sucking that I almost quit the industry just as I was getting started. The pay was terrible, only about 50 cents above minimum wage. The teams were massive, with over 50 people working on a single title, but there were only 4 computers available for the entire team, so we had to wait in line to use them. Our performance was tracked numerically. Each bug report earned 1, 2, or 3 points, and you had to hit a certain quota every week to keep your job. The quota never adjusted for the state of the game. You were expected to meet the same targets whether the game was in pre-alpha or had been released weeks ago and you were just waiting for a hotfix. If a bug was a duplicate, you earned no points and even lost 1 point as a penalty. If the bug wasn't a bug or was marked "will not fix," you could lose or keep points, but there was no clear documentation explaining these rules, and engineers used those statuses interchangeably, which could cost you your job. We weren't allowed to communicate directly with engineers, and any deviation from pre-scripted lines would get you written up or fired. Every Friday, management would walk the floor and fire the weakest performer without fails, creating a grim atmosphere. Stress was so high that at least 2 people a month would quit by simply walking out and never returning. To replace the high turnover, the company brought in about 14 new testers each week and put them through a training camp. Most were fresh out of high school. They'd keep only 1 or a few of them and dismiss the rest with a week's pay, then repeat the cycle the next day with fresh faces. We worked in a building 2 blocks from the corporate office, with no access to promised amenities, and we were told not to use the main entrances because our presence disrupted the office workers. We were excluded from company celebrations or only allowed in hours late without food, drinks, or giveaways. Sometimes, we were given a separate event with just a Costco sheet cake while the main office enjoyed live bands and block parties. One Christmas party was especially disheartening. They took us to a bowling alley and handed out envelopes with just 1 free bowling game and 1 drink ticket. The party was lame, but we got to leave early. The following Friday, over 30 people were fired after management checked who had used their drink tickets. Even those who didn't drink but gave their tickets to others were fired. It was a brutal, toxic environment that crushed morale and drove many away. Story 25. I had a gay friend who was a bit flamboyant. Nothing crazy, he just wore the occasional pair of gladiator sandals. The ones girls wear that look like they're about to go head-to-head in the Roman Colosseum, and had a handlebar mustache. You'd believe such an eccentric character would be more open-minded, but he was actually incredibly racist. Turns out his great-grandmother lived in Nazi Germany and was on the German side of things during the war. To paint you a better picture, this old lady wore black to her grandson's wedding when he married a Jewish girl because the grandmother was mourning the loss. Over time, as the stories began to stack, we all began to grow more and more curious about my friend's great-grandmother to the point that I would occasionally ask him to just tell stories of her. Through this I learned things like how she was physically present for events like the fall of the Berlin Wall, and stuff like that, but never really anything about the woman's personal life. One night my friend was drunk and blurts out how his great-grandmother was also a nuclear administrator for Hitler. I asked him if he was worried that she would get found out, to which he replied that she burned her file herself. I am not sure how true this story is as I am telling it second/third hand, but there are some wild people out there. Story 26. Moments after I was unceremoniously fired because my tech skills were found to be insufficient, the bosses who fired me demanded to know the whereabouts of a hugely important computer file I had worked on. I refused to help them. I even cited the exact language of the NDA I was compelled to sign. I am prohibited from disclosing details of my employment with anyone, including past and current employees of the company. I expounded, adding, "So ask someone who works here, because I don't." It was a great FU moment that I still cherish 5 years later, but now I think I can disclose the truth. I only hid behind the NDA language because I had no clue where to find their damn computer file, or even where to look. I suck with computers. Story 27. My graphic designer best friend won my town's Design the Centennial logo contest, despite having never set foot in the town. I worked for the radio station and just did an interview with one of the organizers, where he lamented that there weren't very many entries. So I called my friend and said, "Want in on this?" He said, "Sure." As he lived on the other side of the country at the time, I spent the next day texting him photos of the town for inspiration. Anyway, when he won and they found out he was a professional graphic designer who lived on the other side of the country, they made him and me sign NDAs because the town was afraid people would think they brought in a ringer. Story 28. I think I'm finally ready to let the world know my secret. If you've ever used VeriSite, the loading spinners you see when the report loads aren't waiting for anything. People kept complaining that reports were coming back too fast, so it must not be working right. It doesn't take long to complete a few hundred Google searches simultaneously. So the loading spinner just makes you wait a few seconds longer, so it feels like more is happening. Story 29. You can buy your way into those best insert profession/school/org lists: best doctors, best dentists, best lawyers, best business schools, best hotels, etc. I worked for one of the publications, and it was a joke. And if your town has a best of contest, with a list of places like best barbecue, best first date spot, and best local band, it's likely that the business-based categories are all won by advertisers. I used to work for a publication that did not do this, which I know because I was in charge of collecting and tallying the results, making sure there was no unethical gamesmanship by tracking IP addresses, etc. But a competing publication did do it, and often advertisers would angrily demand how much to win, and would be even angrier when we told them that winning was not for sale. Once, when I sent out our congratulatory email to winners and placers, I got a very rude message from one of my own clients because they didn't place in their category. I had to reply with a conciliatory, "I'm so sorry that the results weren't in your favor, but of course I think you're the best steak in town. Let's talk about how to raise your profile in ways other than buying more advertising. How does Thursday look?" After which he promptly pulled all advertising, LOL. He would never again take my call and was never again in when I went by. I even dropped off a PDF of every vote that was cast, identifiers removed, to show that the results were legit. I have never seen him again. The restaurant was closed within a year. Honestly, he overshot. He kept saying his restaurant was a Manhattan-style white tablecloth restaurant, and everything was a la carte. So, your steak was $25, and then your salad was an additional $5 to $9, and your side was another cost, etc. This is a budget-conscious, conservative, mid-sized southern town, and no one cares about living an upscale Manhattan-style life. They just want new trucks and a lake house with a dock for their John boat. He didn't close because his restaurant wasn't good. He closed because he didn't know his market and thought he was gifting the people something they didn't even know they wanted. Buy your accolades and know your market. Story 30. This wasn't specifically under an NDA, but I kept it secret for a very long time so I wouldn't lose my job. For nearly 10 years, I worked for a major online retailer. They had some outlet stores where they would sell returned items and extra inventory at a discount. I worked in one of these outlets for my first few years at the company and became an assistant store manager there. One day, my boss and I were by the dumpsters behind the store, going through our damage/destroy pile, merchandise that was damaged or expired and had to be thrown out. The stuff had to be rendered unusable, so we'd take out some frustration smashing this stuff up before it went in the bin. One of the items was this retro-style record player that had come in on a pallet of merchandise samples, but it wouldn't even turn on. So, we're going through all this stuff and finally got to the record player. I picked it up and smashed this thing on the ground. It didn't hurt the record player much, but the front of it cracked slightly. I picked it up, and there was a little piece of plastic sticking out of the front, like from a bag. I said to my boss, "Hey, there's a bag of something inside this." We ended up breaking the record player all the way open. Someone had disassembled it, taken all the electronic parts out of the inside, and replaced them with about 10 vacuum-sealed bags full of a controlled substance. This was in like 2008 or 2009, quite a while before states started legalizing recreational use. There was at least a full pound of it, probably more. I asked my boss what we should do. Should we write up a report? Call the police? My boss told me not to say a word to anyone. He said that if anyone else at our company found out, we'd be under a microscope, people could get fired, and we'd probably end up having to deal with a bunch of new rules. He called his friend, who was a police officer, and explained the situation, and arranged a meeting to surrender the substance. I emptied out a cookware box, put a price sticker on it, and loaded the bags inside. My boss met me at the front register, and I rang him up for the price on the box, so he could get it out of the store without anyone being suspicious. He told me that he handed the bags over to his cop friend, who thought the situation was hilarious. In retrospect, there's a good chance that my boss just kept or sold it all, and the whole surrender it to the cops thing was a ruse. But I like to trust that people are honest with me. Never did find out where the substance came from, who was supposed to get it, or how it ended up at our store. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.